And now we are here. And it is June 7th, and we are thrilled to have a return performance of one of our favorite lecturers and Zoom speakers, John Bauschatz, who's a very honored history professor at the University of Arizona. And he told us the first time he's a papyrologist. Did I pronounce that correctly, John?
Two thumbs
Okay,
up.
a papyrologist, and he will go into more why that is a very, very important thing to be when you're dealing with an ancient culture. He has many credentials, many things that he's done in his classes, and if he wants to mention any specific classes coming up or books or anything, go for it, John. And thank you for being here.
Absolutely. There is literally nothing I would rather be doing at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning in my kitchen than talking to people potentially interested in the subject of the Wild Wild West, police and perps in Ptolemaic Egypt. So thank you again, Gloria, for that fantastic introduction. I am indeed a professor at the U of A. I'm in history and classics departments. I've been there for, gosh, going on 20 years now, I think 18 years. And I've been teaching lots of courses on classics, Greek and Latin in that time. And one of the favorite things that I do is I talk about crime and punishment. I've got a class on crime and punishment I teach pretty much every year, sometimes a couple of times. Did it once for the humanities seminars. So if any of you take courses from the humanities seminars, that might be coming back around in a couple of years. And this is sort of an outgrowth of that, or it's kind of the other way around. As a grad student, I got into papyrology, the study of ancient documents on papyrus paper. And as I was doing that, I sort of discovered this world in the papyri of crime and criminals and law and all sorts of things that I knew nothing about. And that's kind of where I got my start in this world of law and order. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about one aspect of that, which is essentially how police and criminals or accused people interacted in ancient Egypt, in particular Ptolemaic Egypt. And I'll tell you a bit more about that in a minute. So without further ado, I guess I will just go ahead and we'll start. And we're going to start in the present day in a place that I think most of us know pretty well. That would be Tucson, Arizona. Tucson, Arizona, founded in 1775, still exists today. You're looking at a map of Tucson, Arizona, highlighting some of the most important parts in the Tucson landscape, not only the Loft Cinema, the Mini Time Machine Museum of Miniatures, but also EG's. Tucson, a bustling metropolis, lots of things going on in Tucson at all times. It's, of course, the home of the University of Arizona. It is a home to lots and lots of spectacular wildlife, and of course, it is a hub of arts and culture. Um, Now, aside from all of those great things, Tucson is also a place, like most mid-sized cities in our country, that has a fairly sophisticated law enforcement system. Police in our town travel the city in a variety of different kinds of vehicles. You can instantly tell who they are by the coloring of the cars that they're in, by their sirens. They approach rapidly. They sometimes violate traffic laws in so doing. They've even got golf carts. We've got infrastructure for the police that we have in our town. We've got police stations, we've got prisons, we've got jails where we can put people when they need to be held for a little bit of time. If you've spent any time on the streets of Tucson, you've probably seen a uniformed police officer out there doing an investigation into a crime, maybe helping out after an accident, shutting down an intersection for construction work. Easy to see who these people are because they have identifiable uniforms and they've got labels on them that talk to you about what they're doing there on the street. And of course, too, they're out there, like I said, investigating crimes. And we have media in Tucson and all over the country and all over the world now that reports on what police are doing, gives us eyewitness testimony from the scene. And it's not just big companies. But also, of course, now people like social media influencers and even the guy on the street with his phone take video of what happens when police interact with people. So, all in all, however we might feel about the police personally, it's hard not to argue that we've got a pretty sophisticated system of law and order. And now everybody hopefully is saying dun dun because this is the part of the lecture where you go dun dun and I give you an F if you didn't do it. At all of us. So that's today. We're going to rewind a little bit for this talk. We're going to go back in time over 2,000 years To another place that's similar to Tucson in a lot of different ways. It's a desert. We're going to go to Egypt, specifically Ptolemaic Egypt, and you can see sort of a map of what the Ptolemaic part of Egypt looks like. You'll notice that the red boundaries there are just sort of an approximate boundary again. Egyptian civilization throughout much of its history is really just a story of the Nile and settlements up and down the Nile. And this was no different from in Ptolemaic Egypt as well. A couple of important things to know about this part of the world at this time. We're talking essentially about a 300-year dynasty started by one guy, a guy named Ptolemy, son of Lagus, who becomes known as the king Ptolemy I Soter, which means savior. He is the first of a dynasty of kings who lasts for about 300 years. And famously, Ptolemy was one of the generals of Alexander the Great, essentially takes Egypt as his province after the breakup of Alexander's empire and does a pretty good job of establishing a dynasty there. It is a dynasty, the last major dynasty of ancient Egypt, but it's not Egyptian. It's a Greek Macedonian dynasty. And one of the most fascinating aspects of this and some of the other kingdoms of Alexander after Alexander dies is that there's sort of this dual identity of the people who rule these successor states. On the one hand, it's heavily Greek and Macedonian in culture. On the other hand, it fits neatly into this thousand-year Egyptian continuity. And this is brought out really nicely in a lot of the physical stuff that survives, in particular, things like portraiture. These two busts here are both portraits of Ptolemy I, the king. On the left, you see a Greek-style portrait of Ptolemy as a Greek man. On the right, you see a very distinctly different portrait of Ptolemy as an Egyptian pharaoh in the traditional Egyptian style. The Ptolemaic kings had to kind of walk this tightrope between their Greek Macedonian identity on the one hand and their Egyptian identity, at least as leaders of Egypt, on the other. So that's who the Ptolemies are, in brief. As part of that Egyptian identity, the Ptolemies engaged in large building projects. We don't have a ton of large-scale Egyptian archaeology left from the Ptolemaic period. A lot of the stuff was made by mud brick and is destroyed, or modern building has gone over it. But there's a handful of big temples, like the Temple of Horus at Edfu, started in 237, continued to be built in stages all the way down to 57 BC. But it's a really nice example of not only the success of the Ptolemies as builders, but also as their embrace of Egyptian culture. This is an Egyptian-style temple. And even if you don't know hieroglyphs, you can see on the wall, we've got representations of Egyptian gods. And so they're sort of playing in to that Egyptian culture. So they're rulers, they're embracing the past while also expressing themselves. And just like in Tucson, Ptolemaic Egypt was also a place where arts and culture thrived, right? And no, admittedly, they did not have dirt bags in Ptolemaic Egypt. They did, however, have bags of dirt. Because, it's a desert, they have bags of dirt. This is the point in the lecture when my students are looking at me like they can't believe I've just said that. And then I put this slide up, which is a tumbleweed. And I just kind of make a whistling noise like, shh, because it's like you could hear a pin drop. So to be fair, that's a joke. But to be fair as well, Ptolemaic Egypt was the home of the most important city in the Mediterranean at the time. And that would, of course, be Alexandria, which was the city of its day of the Hellenistic period. And in particular, arts and culture. A couple of really famous places founded by the Ptolemies there. You've probably heard of the Library of Alexandria and the Museum. Museon, literally a temple to the muses. You can see on this reconstruction where those were. These were beacons to creative people in antiquity. And lots of writers, dramatists came to the court of the Ptolemies to write and perform. And some of the greatest literature of the age was created there and, of course, copied and stored in the library. So, quick snapshot of what we're talking about there with Egypt. Like Tucson today, Egypt under the Ptolemies had issues with crime. And more surprising than that is that they had a pretty sophisticated law enforcement system to deal with it. And has someone written about this in an overpriced book? Yes, they have. That was me, 10, 12 years ago. Came out of my dissertation, Law Enforcement in Ptolemaic Egypt. It's a story, essentially, of papyri, like this papyrus here on the cover of the book. The papyri, the paper that survives from this civilization, tell us a really miraculous story of how police interacted with people and what the law enforcement system in Egypt was like. It tells a story that we don't have evidence for pretty much anywhere else in the world. And it's, like I said, it's fascinating. And I'm hopeful that I'm going to be able to show you a little bit of that story today. So there is a story to tell, and I'm going to tell you a bit of that story in what follows. And the focus is going to be on interactions between police agents and people in Ptolemaic Egypt. What I'm going to do in what follows is give you 4 examples of papyri, pieces of paper, that tell different kinds of stories. And they're going to highlight 4 major police functions under the Ptolemies. The 4 functions in these gigantic all caps letters are the following: apprehension, so arresting people; detention, putting them in jail; investigation, looking into the details of criminal activity; and prosecution, trial. Papyri give us all sorts of cool insights on all 4 of these areas of police activity. And so that's my goal. Gloria had mentioned possibility of questions along the way, and that's totally fine. What I'm going to do is I'll present an example to you. I'll read what it says, give you a couple of important takeaways from that example, and then before I move on to the next one, I'll pause and see if anybody has any questions. If you want to ask a question, then totally fine. You can use the raise your hand thing on Zoom, or you can turn your mic on and just interrupt me. But there'll be time for questions at the end too, if you want to kind of like let it all seep in and then reflect and ask at the end. Last thing I'll say before we move to our first example is you'll notice in the examples I give you, I think 3 out of the 4, 2 out of the 4 actually, are what are known as petitions. And these are basically letters written by people to an official asking for help of some kind. And in our case, they're essentially writing because of alleged wrongdoing, and they want people to come out and help them. And that's definitely the case with example number 1. Example number 1, we'll talk a little bit about apprehension or arrest. It's a little episode that I like to call Shakedown in Kerkasuka. And it's a Greek petition written in 109 BC. And look at it, there it is right there on the left. I'll have a couple of comments about the makeup of this papyrus and some of the neat details in a second. But I'm going to start by just telling you what it says. And I've got my little handy dandy translation here. So here are the contents of the letter. To Ptolemaios, governor, from Petermuthus, son of Pedaeus, soldier with 7 acres of land, of those recruited by Commanus, and also a disabled cobbler of those in Tebtunis of the Polemon division, but living in Oxyrhyncha of the same division. On the first of the intercalary days of the month of Mesere, year 8, Dionysius, police chief of the division, arriving in the village with Demetrius and Apollonius the herald, and Teos and Necthanibus and others, entered into my workshop. And after he seized me, they led me through the village with every form of mistreatment and insolence and blows, all the way up to the middle of town. And they did not release me before shaking me down for the sum of 4 silver drachmas and 1,300 bronze drachmas. And they forced Pnepharos, son of Horos, another soldier, to place at the bank in my name for the police chief an IOU payable to Arios, the grain transport official, for the sum of 44 silver drachmas. And in addition, they forced this same Arios to accept the 44 silver drachmas for the police chief, abusing me because I am helpless and disabled. And they also carried off the clothes I was wearing. I should just jut in here. And they carried off the clothes I was wearing is an interlinear addition, almost as if the guy was telling his story to a scribe, and then he remembered, oh yeah, put in the part about me getting my clothes stolen. And the scribe had to write that in between the lines because there was no space to add it when he added in there. Anyway, so apparently stole his clothes. I ask that you not overlook me, but if it does not seem improper, please send. And you'll notice at the bottom, it breaks off, and that's where it says, please send. We don't actually know what he wants him to send, but we actually do know the end of the papyrus. The very end says, and if this takes place, whatever thing was missing in the gap, I shall receive your assistance. Year 8, month of Mesere, intercalary day 1. Farewell. So we've got a letter here to the governor of the province from a man who alleges he's been abused by a police chief and a bunch of other guys who beat him up, dragged him through town, stole his clothes, and made him pay an exorbitant sum of money. Sounds to me like he's done nothing wrong, and these people are a bunch of jerks, right? And that seems to be what's happening here. Couple of takeaways from this letter that we see not only here but in other places. The arrest that takes place here, the abduction, seems to be kind of like a SWAT operation, right? A bunch of people have gathered together, they bust into a place, they grab somebody, and they haul them off. We see this kind of arrest happening time and time again. Um, Not always, though. We have these kinds of coordinated arrests occurring, but also arrests can just be spontaneous. Lots of incidences where somebody says they see wrongdoing, they get attacked, they talk to an official who happens to be on the scene, and that official will come in, grab the person, and haul them away. So we can plan arrests, but we can also do them spontaneously if the moment demands it. Another thing this makes clear is it's not just police officials who can organize arrests. In this case, we've got a police chief who seems to be the head honcho, but he's got a bunch of other guys who aren't even officially policemen helping him out. A herald is helping, an inspector is helping. It's almost like he gathered up a posse of whoever was available to help him do this, and then they went off and carried out the arrest that way. So there's a flexibility here for police. You don't have to have necessarily guys in uniform helping you out when you're carrying out police business like this. Probably the biggest takeaway when you read this for the first time is just how unjust the whole thing sounds. We've got the letter from this poor cobbler who doesn't fail to mention not only that his clothes were stolen and he was beat up, but he's also disabled, right? He wants the person reading the letter to feel bad for him and feel like he's being abused for that reason. And it's hard not to jump to the conclusion after reading this that, yeah, the police chief's a really mean guy and he got all his buddies and they decided to go beat this man up. But this is a fairly common trope when you read letters from people who allege abuse. And another common trope in these letters is that these people were shaken down for money. A lot of money was taken from them. One thing we definitely know was a major problem in Ptolemaic Egypt was debtors not paying debts to the state. And police were often employed by the state to go out and get money from people who owed debts by essentially any means. There's plenty of examples of break-ins, seizures of property, and rough treatment in the papyri that detail just the kind of stuff that is described here. So you have to keep that in the back of your mind when you read this letter and others like it to wonder whether you're getting the whole story. Like, did this guy owe a lot of money and not pay it? And the police said, well, we're just going to take it. Again, we can't really tell. But again, it's not just debts that you get arrested for. Lots of other offenses can lead to this too. Theft, breaking and entering, violence, all of these things might get somebody grabbed and dumped in a cell of detention. That's all I wanted to say about this example and arrest in general. I see there's a comment in the chat. Slide was for ASU. Was that a joke, Bob? I have no idea what you're talking about there. Are there any questions about this example before we move on? Again, like I said, if there aren't, we can certainly talk more about this at the end. And if there aren't, I'll quickly just show you a couple things on this papyrus that I think are kind of neat in terms of its physical layout. We'll zoom in. This is pretty much the middle of the papyrus. One thing you notice here is that we have fairly regular writing with a certain amount of line spacing in between lines. And then you'll notice there's a couple places where the scribe has written things in between the lines. What else do you notice? Anybody want to unmute themselves and tell me what you can see here on the letters that I'm sort of circling, and also these letters down here? There's a strike through. This is essentially how you erase. When you make a mistake, you've got text you don't want to read, you dash through it, and then you typically write something on top of it. That's your delete and replace. And so we've got deleting and replacing here. The suggestion is, since this papyrus has deleting and replacing on it, it probably was a draft of a letter. Wasn't actually sent. The first draft they did, and then they wrote a clean version that eventually got sent to the official. One other thing that's kind of neat, worth noting here too, if you look at the top of the document, the very first line is actually the third line on the piece of papyrus. These two lines here at the top Clearly, the scribe ran out of room at the end of the papyrus because these are the last two lines of the letter. He had to use the top margin to finish the letter. Another good example of this not actually being a letter that was sent, but a draft version of that letter. Anyway, a couple of fun notes on the physical element of papyri. I'll be happily talk more about papyri at the end if you have questions about them. I have a whole second slideshow with the slides you can look at if there's interest in time, but no pressure. We all have grocery stores to get to. I know how it is. All right, we're going to move on to example number 2, detention. I'm going to call this one Captivity in Kerkasuka. It's another petition. It's also in Greek, dates to the 3rd century BC. And alas, I do not have an image of the papyrus, much to my chagrin. So you're going to look at these kittens breaking out of jail while I read you what I like to call Captivity in Kerkasuka. It's another petition. It's a letter from a man to, of all people, the king of the country. And here's how it goes. Dionysodoros to King Ptolemy, greetings. I am wronged by the jailer in Kerkasuka, for I was passing time with my kinsman, Apollonius, and he asked me for certain records which he had given to me to watch over. But when I was unable to find them, he, becoming angry with me, thought it fitting that Spinther, the policeman in Kerkasuka, detain me. And he, meaning Spinther, the policeman, leading me off to the prison there, told the jailer the reason for my detention, so that, if Apollonius should command it, the jailer might release me. But now he has led me off to the prison in Crocodilopolis, yes, that means city of crocodiles, claiming that I am a wrongdoer. And though Apollonius thought it fitting that he release me, he did not obey. Wherefore I need you to, and of course that's where the papyrus breaks off. So many great stories, so many papyri that break off, but this is the sort of the heartbreak you live with if you're a papyrologist. So that's the end. We have a man in prison who had been arrested essentially because his relative was mad at him for like losing his tax returns or something like that, puts him in prison, and then instead of getting released, the jailer takes him to another prison in another town where he is now locked up. And who's he writing to? He's writing to the king of the country, asking for help. We'll come back to that in just a second. So what does this tell us about jailing, detention in Ptolemaic Egypt? Well, one thing, we can certainly see that police have the power to detain someone and not only hold them, but take them to a holding place. And that's exactly what happens here. We got a policeman. The man who is writing is handed over to the policeman, and the policeman puts him in a jail. At the jail, we have our own personnel. Policemen don't work at the jail. We have specific guys who work at the jail, and I've translated the term desmophulax, which means guard of a prisoner, as jailer here. And that's who we have working at the jail. It's clear that these guys did, in fact, spend their time at Ptolemaic jails and were responsible primarily for taking in and then discharging prisoners who were given to them or then ordered for release. How do we know about prison? Well, the majority of things we know about the prison come from letters from prisoners, like the one that you just read. We've got dozens and dozens of papyri that were written by primarily guys who end up in jail for one reason or another. 9 times out of 10, in the letters they write to the outside world, they declare that they've done nothing wrong, that there's no reason for them to be in jail, and often they highlight just how miserable the experience of being in jail is. Now, that's probably not surprising. I don't know that jail is sort of designed as a happy fun land, but some of the details we get in these letters are surprisingly stark. The prisoners routinely say that they have none of the necessities of life and will die if left in prison much longer. It suggests that prisoners didn't necessarily get food or access to the necessities, and that they relied on people from the outside to come and bring them stuff. A related question is how long somebody might stay in jail. And this is a hard question to answer, but we do have attestations for a number of prison terms. In most cases, it looks like people were in jail for a few days or maybe a week or 2 at the most before they found a way to get out. There are a handful of cases in which people were in prison for a couple of months, and maybe 2 in which prisoners alleged they had been in jail for a period of years, up to 2 years. That's striking because in the ancient world, prison was not a penalty. That is to say, you would not get a prison sentence as the result of a trial, right? You wouldn't be handed that for your crime. Prison is used for two main things. Number one, it's temporary detention before you go to trial, or it's temporary detention before your sentence is pronounced while you're awaiting the judge's decision. So it's a temporary holding cell. The only other way you'd end up in prison long term is if you owed a debt. So debt imprisonment is something that exists in the ancient world, and it certainly exists in Ptolemaic Egypt. It's likely that the people that claim in their letters that they were in prison for, a few months or even a year or two were people who owed debts that they could not pay and were stuck. Um, that's kind of a catch-22 if you're thinking about it. It's hard to be productive and make money to pay off a debt if you're stuck in a prison cell. And you could see how a situation like that could end up being a never-ending situation, especially if a person in prison for debt didn't have people on the outside who could help them out and make arrangements to get them out. And it looks like that happened every now and again. All right, so just a little bit about imprisonment there. If there's any questions about that, happy to pause for a second. If not, we can move on to part 3 and see whether there's more cats. I'm going to give it away. There's actually no more cats. This is the cat. So look at it now if you're only at this lecture for the cats. All right, we're moving on to part 3. Anybody remember what part 3 is? If you do, type it in the chat or go ahead and tell me now. Otherwise, I'm just going to tell you.
Investigation.
Exactly. There we go. Applause, applause. We're moving on to investigation. Boom. Investigation. This is a little example I like to call graft and Bastis. This papyrus is not a petition. It's an official report describing elements of a police investigation. Dates to the middle of the 2nd century BC. Why don't I just tell you what it says? Here we go. Horanus to Sosibius, greetings. When Petazeuchus, the man in charge of the police in Bastis, came to see us, it was reported that there had been some thefts at the royal threshing floor on the 4th night of the month of Pachon, and that the thieves had made off with 14 measures of grain. And it was reported that after he had carried out a search with the police, he discovered 8 measures of the stolen grain at the house of Petazeuchus, son of Horas, which he handed over to Agathis, a policeman, while we ourselves were present. And similarly, he discovered at the threshing floor of Calais that 6 measures of grain had been removed from their sacks. And applying a seal, we transferred the grain to the royal granary. Since, therefore, both Petazeuchus and Calais, having had a hand in this business, have fled, I make this report so that you may know. Farewell, year 40, Pachon 15. So, nice, short, official report here. We've got a man involved with police affairs. Doesn't give a title. He just describes his name, and the guy he's writing to doesn't have a title either. They clearly knew who they were, but they don't always tell us on their papers who they are. But they're clearly connected to the world of police. And what do we have? We've got a report of official wrongdoing. Looks like a couple of guys have busted into a granary. They've stolen some grain. And the police, once they get the report, spring into action, and they start doing a lot of footwork. This is a really nice example of the variety of different things police officials could do once they got wind of illicit activity. What's some of the stuff that we see here? Well, among the activities, we see that visit to a crime scene occurs. One of the first things police do even today. They look around and they see if there's any evidence. In this case, we've got sacks of grain that have been tampered with. We've got sacks of grain that are missing. The police confiscate stuff that is potentially involved in the investigation, sacks of grain. They move it someplace else. They also sealed up the home or the threshing floor from which the grain had been stolen. Same thing happens today. Police put that caution tape around it. They lock the door. They tell nobody's allowed to come back. Police did this in antiquity as well. Interesting to note that I don't think we know what the seal consists of, but it's some sort of a lock so that nobody can get in there while they're investigating what's happening. Another thing they do is they start looking for perpetrators, right? They look around town, they try to talk to people to find out whether or not anybody has seen anything or anybody knows anything. And they very quickly identify a couple of guys who appear to have been involved in some of the breaking and entering and perhaps the pilfering of the grain. Um, we also see at the end of this letter that there's a potential jump to a conclusion. And this is specifically when we talk about the two guys they've identified, Petazoukas and Calais. Um, the writer says they had a hand in this business, suggesting that this is due to the fact that they've fled, right? He's connecting the dots. These guys ran away, i.e., they must be guilty of something. That's the same kind of, I think, leap to a conclusion that we very well might make today if we're a police officer or if we're playing like, a crime game where the evidence seems to suggest one possible conclusion, but it's always open to interpretation. One thing that's worth pointing out here is the possibility that the two guys who ran away knew that they were implicated in this investigation, but we don't have any clear evidence that they were involved from the document, and it's possible that they ran away to avoid persecution. We certainly have lots of evidence that people in this civilization would sometimes feel the strong arm of the law especially heavily and would flee, not necessarily because of guilt, but because they believed they would be unfairly persecuted for involvement. Don't know what happened here, but it's worth considering that as well. So a couple other things to note, and we'll move on to that last example I've got for you. We're seeing here that the police are carrying out this investigation simply off of a tip. So there's autonomy involved here. These guys aren't just robots that you turn on like, little Law and Order Roombas the moment you think something needs to be done. They hear something and then they spearhead the investigation themselves, doing the kinds of things that they're trained to do. So they can perform a lot of tasks because they know how to do these tasks. The other thing I would point out, and this is going to draw your attention back to the document, is that this is paperwork. Why is it that the man writing this letter is writing the letter? Well, he tells us at the end, he says, "I've written this so that you may know." He's essentially creating a document, a record of what they've done. He's kind of like, pardon the expression, he's covering his own ass a little bit here, detailing what he and his colleagues have accomplished and giving all the information that they know to a guy who is clearly a superior. Not just so they can have a record of it, but I think also to protect his job and avoid any kind of allegations of malfeasance against him down the road. And as we saw a minute ago, police could in fact be accused of rough treatment and corruption from time to time. So paper trail, always a great thing. Last comment connects to that paper trail. Unlike the first papyrus I showed you, if you look at this one, this is a really, really nice specimen of a papyrus. You can see there's only a couple places where there's holes where the text is, and we can basically read the entire thing quite easily. You'll notice too that there's pretty healthy margins on all sides of this text, well, at least top, left, and bottom, especially at bottom. There's a lot of space left there. Out of curiosity, without even reading this, is there any reason why you might look at this and say, oh, this is clearly a piece of government paper, right? This is an official letter, just based on how much space is left. Anybody have an idea why that might be the case? Why just looking at this document, we could conclude that this is probably a piece of government writing as opposed to something.
Could I answer?
Go for it.
Yes, it's only a guess, but the government had more money for papyrus and citizens were using what they had.
That's exactly right. When you see something with generous margins like this, it shows a writer who is not concerned about using every little scrap of papyrus they have, which is what we tend to see in private correspondence, because papyrus isn't free. It's produced by the government. They have a monopoly on its production and sale. And you see, when you see this kind of waste of papyrus, you think that's government waste right there. They don't care about the cost. They'll just leave it blank and no big deal. At all events, it's kind of a neat connection between the physical layout and the kind of document you see on it, at least in my mind. So investigation. Let's see if there's any questions here. Let's see. Yes, Bob, it does say that. I guess it must be a mistake or it must be a joke. I don't know. I'm going to have to go back and look afterwards and see. I think maybe you can figure out whether it's a joke or not, but we'll come back to it at the end of the lecture. Um, anyway, let's go to number 4, the last step on in the process. This is actually sort of a kind of a trial of the century moment here. Fairly famous papyrus. Um, prosecution, trial in Kerchios. And I'll tell you why this is a sort of famous papyrus in a second. But I'll give you a kind of a hint here. So not only does it involve the king and queen, as a former example we used a minute ago does, but it also involves a known individual. Vast majority of papyri we have are just letters from one random guy we've never heard of to some other random guy we've never heard of. When you find a person mentioned multiple times in a papyrus, in multiple papyri, it's exciting because you start to build details of their lives. You can find out what their career was, where they lived, how long they held an office, how much they were paid, stuff like that. You rarely find out more than just a few details about a person. The writer in this one is a really well-known guy. He's a scribe. And well, I'll give you the papyrus and we'll talk more about this in a second. But like I say, gives you the details of a trial, and you'll see just how detailed these details are in just a sec. Trial in Kerchios. To King Ptolemy and Queen Cleopatra the sister and Queen Cleopatra the wife, that's right, 2 Cleopatras, benefactor gods, greetings. Menkes, the village scribe of Kerchios of the Polemon division of the Arsinoite province, and his brother, Polemon. Quick aside there, I love this. We have the village scribe gives all of his titles, and then he tacks on his brother, who is like a nobody at the end. But Menkes and his brother, they're the ones writing the letter. On the 17th of the month of Hathor of the present 53rd year, when we learned that a certain Asclepiades, an agent of Aminius, the police commissioner of the same province, had arrived in the village, as is customary, we met up with him, along with the village chief and some of the elders of the farmers, and Demetrius, the man holding the offices of mayor and police chief in the same village, and others. Having no something or other, and I believe that's right here. There's a hole. We don't know what he didn't have, but it's insignificant. We greeted him. So he and his brother meet up with this guy, and he arrested us. A quick turn of events. And he also arrested Demetrius and one of the farmers, Mares, son of Patos, saying that a petition had been submitted against us, and also against Maron, son of Diodorus, Petazeuchus, son of somebody, there's a hole in the papyrus, and Simon, son of somebody else, all from the same village, as well as Artemidorus, village scribe of Ibion Ecosipenta. So we got like a list of 7 or 8 guys who all get arrested. Again, he said that a petition had been submitted by Hariotes, son of Harsagesus, an inhabitant of Crocodilopolis, stating that all of the accused had dined with him at a tavern in the village, and that he had been poisoned. Wherefore, brought before Aminius on the 19th of the same month, and Aminius is the police commissioner, just to remind you, we were immediately released from the examination, at which Aminius, the royal scribe, was present, due to our innocence. And that's not the end of the papyrus. That's about halfway. If you look closely, and I'll zoom in again, there's actually 2 columns of text here. We've basically gotten down to almost the end of the first column in my translation. He goes on for a bit more, but Menkes essentially is writing this letter not only to tell us what happened, but to request protection from the king and the queens, because in spite of the fact that they had this trial and he was released because he was innocent, according to him, he's still getting blowback at the local level. People are angry and he's experiencing difficulties. So he's writing a letter to the king and the queens asking for protection. And what's cool about this papyrus is that we have evidence that it was sent and that it was returned, because at the very bottom of the second column of text, we have a response in the voice of the king and the queens saying, please do as he requests. You'll notice this is a really, really tiny amount of text compared to the 2 columns of letter that he writes. But it's cool because it shows us not only that letters got sent, but that letters got commented on by the recipients, and that sometimes they could find their way back to the sender. This is essentially proof from the king and queen that somebody The king, the queens, or at least somebody in their administration read the letter and made a decision about it. So kind of a fun little side note there. But we're looking at this not just because it involves flashy punishment, poisoning, and it involves a famous person, Menkes, the village scribe, who we know a ton about because we have dozens and dozens of papers from his office, but also because it tells us a bit about trials. Um, and the key word there is bit. It tells us very little, in fact, about trials. And surprisingly enough, that very little is fairly common in the documents that talk about trials. So what do we know from our documents about criminal trials? Well, in most cases, they seem to have been fairly brief and fairly simple. People charged with crimes, theft, breaking and entering, assault, rare cases like attempted murder, they're typically brought before an official or a couple of officials, and typically we don't get anything like a stenographer writing down a detailed account of what was brought in, who the witnesses were, what was said. We just essentially say who was there and what the result was. And that's exactly what happens here. Menkes and his brother and these other guys who get arrested show up in front of the police commissioner. They appear innocent, which is essentially what he says, and they're released. That is what we know about this trial. And in most cases where we hear about trials, it's that degree of description as well. It's really frustrating. We do know that witnesses could appear from time to time, and not typically because of trial records, but because of other documents like letters to officials in which people say, yeah, I was going to have a trial, and I have a bunch of witnesses who are going to show up, but my opponent intimidated them and they all ran away. So we know that witnesses could come and speak, but we often don't get to hear what they say because in many cases they don't show up. We know that they could write testimony, however, if they didn't want to show up in person, and that sometimes would be brought in. Another thing we know about trials is that often judgments were by default. And that is to say, often one side would show up, the other side wouldn't appear. And so the side that show up would win. Typically, it's the prosecution, the people with an axe to grind or a grudge, who are the ones who show up. The other side doesn't show up, and so judgment is by default. And again, there could be a lot of different reasons why someone would show up. They are actually guilty. They're afraid they're not going to get the result they want. But again, we don't know because without their side of the story being presented, we can only conjecture. Last thing I'll say, and then I'll open the floor to any comments or questions. Poisoning. The crime of poisoning. This is, I believe, the only example in all of the documents from Ptolemaic Egypt of somebody being accused of poisoning. Murder in general is extremely rare in the texts as well. Doesn't mean murder didn't happen or attempted murder, but we just don't hear about it for whatever reason. The only other text I know of in which murder is related is a fragmentary report in which an official is describing someone who had gone missing and then describes seeing body parts scattered along the road before the papyrus breaks off. So it looks like somebody got killed, but we don't really know in any detail what was done by officials in that particular case. Anyway, so that brings us to the end of our little journey with cops and robbers this morning. But I'll go back and entertain any questions about this particular case or about trials, and I'm happy to open the floor to anybody who wants to ask questions about anything else as well.
Could I first make an apology to Imad? You have one of our audiences there in Cairo at the moment, and
Oh, wow.
But so unfortunately, there was a mistake on one of my, not all of them, but on one of my emails where it said this was tomorrow. So he came a bit late, but it will be recorded, and we will have quite a bit more of this meeting. It isn't over yet, Imad. I apologize, whatever that mistake was. And we're so happy to have someone from Cairo here in the meeting, and all of you. Okay, so
I'm happy too. And I noticed there's some questions in the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and address some of those. So Hugh asked a couple minutes ago about the papyri, and you're exactly right. They're all in Greek. We, of course, have a tiny minority of the population is Greek speaking in Ptolemaic Egypt, 5%. maybe. Vast majority of people are Egyptians who speak Egyptian. And those who could write would have written in Egyptian. The vast majority of the papyri we have, however, from this civilization are in Greek. And the reason for this is that we have a top-down administration where Greek is the language of business and government. The Ptolemies and the Greeks in general are really, really big into paperwork. And once they take over in the late 4th century BC, they start setting up an infrastructure that relies on Greek to get things done. There certainly is lots and lots of daily business and operations going on in Egyptian. Demotic Egyptian is the version of the language at the time, and we do indeed have papyri in Demotic and petitions in Demotic and records of crime in Demotic, but the majority are Greek. The reality was, once the Ptolemies became kings, that if you wanted to get something done in the government, it was virtually guaranteed that you needed to have Greek in order to appeal to these primarily Greek-speaking and reading officials. And so even people who were Egyptian, and the majority of people writing these letters are clearly Egyptian, they've got Egyptian names, they'd have to go to a scribe who knew Greek and could put their story into Greek if they wanted to have any hope of getting justice. So Egyptian certainly widely spoken. Arabic not really coming into the Egyptian world until the 7th century AD. So we've got another 1,000 or so years. Greek is the predominant language of business and government until then. Not only under the Ptolemies, but also under the Romans after they take over. As for Bob's question, Bob asks whether we can convert the dates into the Julian calendar. Yes, absolutely. And I think what you're talking about here is when I'm saying, for example, like, on the 5th day of the month of Meher in, year 62 or whatever. Precisely. That's exactly what the papyri say, but we can nail those down exactly. We can say that that's exactly April 5th, 132 BC, and we do. If you look, for example, at the slide you're looking at right now, we know that this petition was from 117 BC because the letter, when Menkes is writing his letter, he says the trial took place in Mesere year 8. And if we can figure out what king it is, it means the 8th year of his reign. And all of the Ptolemaic kings have datable reigns. So once you know who the king is, you know the number of the year in his reign, you can get a Julian date for that. And there are people who have gone through and figured out exactly when each Egyptian month falls in each one of those years. So we can, in fact, get precise dates for most papyri. Thankfully, I don't have to do that. We've got people who have already figured that out already. So those are the questions from the chat. I'm more than happy to entertain any other questions that people may have. We can look at the cats again too. They haven't gone.
Yeah, I like the cats, but I have a question.
Sure.
What about the rights of the accused? Are there any papyri about prisoner rights or accused rights? Where how would they or not have been protected the way we do, or are they protected?
Yeah, that is a great question. So a couple things I can say about that. We have nothing like a code of laws from Ptolemaic Egypt. So we don't know if there were universal protections for people against, unlawful search and seizure, that kind of stuff. Ancient Greek civilizations tended to write laws on stone. They would inscribe them. And so we have fragments of laws from other places like Athens and other Greek city-states that tell us what the laws were. There likely were such laws in Egypt as well, but we basically have virtually none of those. For whatever reason, the Ptolemies were not big on inscriptions, or if they were big on inscriptions on stone that didn't survive over a couple thousand years. What we do have, however, since this is a kingdom, we have surviving scraps of papyrus that are royal proclamations. And occasionally, if you look at my shirt, which I wore just for the occasion, things like the Rosetta Stone, if you're familiar with this, we have royal decrees that were engraved on stone that does survive. And the decree of a king is essentially law. So decrees could stand in for law. And we have scraps from actual papyrus decrees that survive. in which the king appears to be saying, you're not allowed to do this, i.e., you're not allowed to arrest somebody and detain them if it's for personal reasons. And that's an example of a decree I was just looking at by happenstance a couple of days ago. So there do seem to have been reactions of the government to claims of abuse and stuff like that. And they would put out decrees, and these would be copied and sent to scribes all throughout the countryside for dissemination to officials. Whether or not the average Joe on the street would actually ever hear of that or see it, or if he could see it, could read it, really hard to say. But there were at least occasionally provisions in the government to cut down on stuff that was seen as illegal. Um, but how extensive that was, I'm not entirely sure. Looks like there's another comment in the chat. Um, yeah. So Bob's comment here about the Saturday Night Live skit about cops in ancient Egypt. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly lots of great examples of stuff like this. Episodes like stuff that you see in papyri that has made it into the mainstream. Um, if we were to go back a little bit further, there's a really nice example of an Egyptian story called The Eloquent Peasant. I'm not sure if anybody's ever heard of The Eloquent Peasant. Story of an Egyptian peasant who travels down into Egypt to get food for his family. And he's abused by this wealthy man who forces him to either move his donkey onto the land of the landowner or trample the wealthy man's cloak. He's put in this catch-22 situation. And once the donkey like eats a wisp of barley, the peasant is kidnapped, put in jail, all his stuff is taken, and he's beaten up. And he then spends the next 9 days in jail. And he constantly pleads to the king and his second in command about how he needs to get out and how unjust everything is. And the king and the second in the command listen to him delivering these pleas, and they're these eloquent speeches. And they decide, you know what? We're going to keep him in jail just so we can listen to him complain about the mistreatment and beg to get out because he's such an eloquent peasant. And then finally, at the end of the ordeal, the peasant says, I give up. I quit. I'm going to go complain about you to Anubis, who's the god of the dead, which essentially means he's going to kill himself because he's being so abused. And it's only then that the king's like, okay, let him out of jail. And he gets out of jail. And the guy who abused him and made him go to jail in the first place loses his job, and the peasant gets all his stuff. And it's a happy ending when you overlook the stuff about the peasant getting abused and put in jail and threatening suicide. I always have the students in my crime and punishment class read this. It's, a good 1,000 years before the Ptolemaic period, but it gives you an idea that even a millennium prior to these papyri, there was still wrongdoing and abuse and people begging for freedom, begging for help in one way or another. Anyway, shout out to the eloquent peasant there. Any other questions for me?
This is amazing. I'm going to have to go. Is it online, The Eloquent Peasant?
Oh, you can look it up. And I think actually the reason I realize now, the reason I brought this up, I think back in the 60s, that an Egyptian film company made a movie of this.
Oh,
And
well,
last I heard, that movie is available for viewing on YouTube. It's in Arabic, but
wow.
maybe subtitles. So yeah, if you want to see a guy get mistreated and then beg for freedom and rail against injustice, it might be just the thing for you.
Maybe Emad would know of that film. I don't know. Emad, are you with us?
Eloquent Peasant. I have not watched it. I keep threatening to, but I never do it. So we'll see. But it's out there. And it's another example of sort of like Egypt being used as a place for sort of law and order stuff. 1850 BC. There you go. Is that Eloquent Peasant's date, or is that the purported date of the Moses Saturday Night Live skit?
That was Wikipedia about eloquent peasant.
Eloquent Peasant. So second millennium. Yeah, quite a while ago.
It's amazingly way back in time. That's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, it's literature, right? So ancient literature, if it was popular enough, it was widespread, it got copied, and you luck out. A few copies survive in tombs down to this day, and there you go.
Are there any other stories of that? Because I didn't know there were any stories other than funerary incantations and things coming from that early in Egypt. Are there others, or is that it?
Oh no, there's lots and lots of different kinds of Egyptian literature. A lot of it sort of falls under the rubric of wisdom literature. It's supposed to be sort of a teaching thing. And there's a number of texts that sort of deal with how a ruler's supposed to rule, like sort of letters of advice from a king to his son. And they kind of give you an idea of how like the Egyptian elite saw themselves and what their position was and how they were supposed to deal with poor people or oppressed people. Gives you an idea of what at least that part of society thought about. But yeah, there's lots of great stories. Many of them don't survive in ancient Egyptian, but there are versions of them in, say, Greek or in Arabic, essentially translations or reframing of ancient tales that came down to earlier civilizations, and they recorded the stories. Famous example, the Greek writer Plutarch tells us a version of the story of Isis and Osiris. One of the most complete versions of that story we have is written by a Greek in the second century AD because he knew it from sources that we no longer have today.
Oh, I see. Imad did a search in Arabic and it's in the chat. He didn't find it in Arabic, but
Yeah, maybe it's been taken down. I know at least a couple of years ago, somebody on the papyrology listserv said, "Hey, look, it's up on YouTube." Maybe no more. Anyway, but now you know it could pop up at any time.
hmm.
Maybe it's on Netflix. I haven't looked.
Oh, amazing. And if you could email me a couple links to that story and a couple others, I will email them to everyone who came.
Sure. Be happy to. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I actually have got a couple of PDFs I can give you some stories from that I give to my students for reading.
Oh,
Can't find good translations online. Happy to send those along.
so this is an amazing treasure that I don't think most people realize, and especially, looping back to science fiction, I think we could develop something with ancient Egypt because there's so much more out there, and someone going back there, it wouldn't just all be sketchy and we make it up. They'd have
Yeah.
quite a bit.
No, I mean, these documents, they give you a grain of a degree of detail that you don't have from anything else. You know the ins and outs of people's everyday lives. And there's a lot of material for that kind of fiction writing. Absolutely.
And
Uh, and plenty of things we don't know, which someone who wanted to write about this civilization could easily step in and fill in some gaps.
you told me once how many, this was in the last time when you talked, when you were there in person, about how many little mummies of animals there were. It was amazing, the sheer number of these animals.
Yes. And actually, the animals, like it has to do with the Egyptian society. You've got all sorts of different animal cults, animals sacred to particular gods and goddesses. And heck, maybe I can quickly just show you a couple of examples here.
Oh, great.
Can you see the papyrology slides right now or no?
That's what I'm seeing, one with a circle. Um, it's the, I think I don't know, it's the one right before the end, the last slide.
Okay, so if you just bear with me for a second here, I'm going to
Sure.
do
Well,
this
we have a
slideshow.
3-hour meeting, I think I set up, so
A
on my,
3 hour meeting.
yeah,
I'm gonna leave before
no.
that meeting
I
then.
always do that just to make sure, if people get really like into an ecstatic state and just don't want to leave or whatever,
I gotcha.
we get disconnected and have to go back or something.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, let me just real quick. I mean, since you brought up the animal mummies, I'm gonna go ahead and I'll share my screen again just for a second because who doesn't like looking at animal mummies? And it gives me
Oh,
an
I
opportunity.
love looking at animal mummies.
Gives me a great opportunity to tell a terrible joke, which is the main reason why I do these presentations for people. Um, but anyway, so we're looking at a different slideshow here.
Oh,
So yeah, so mummies, right? One of the main ways that can we all see the cat mummy here, the various cat
yeah,
mummies on the screen?
poor kitty.
One of the main ways that we get papyri is from mummies, right? They're used not only as wrapping, but also as stuffing in mummies. For human mummies, they kind of make a paper mache face mask on a lot of the mummies, and often the papyri used in that process can be taken apart and read and there's documents on it. But mummies aren't just humans, right? The Egyptians have a number of gods that have sacred animals, and these gods had temples all over the countryside. The temples would raise the sacred animals and then kill them and mummify them, and these would be used as essentially offerings to those gods and goddesses that pilgrims or the faithful could buy as essentially souvenirs when they would visit these temples. And so for this reason, you can see there's, of course, cat mummies that we find. I believe, hold on, I'm trying to think of the name of the cat god. It's
Is it Mott?
Ma-
Not
not Mayat. That Mayat's the god of justice.
Oh, no, okay.
Somebody's gonna know. I'm totally
Yeah,
blanking on her name.
somebody's gonna look it up. I used to know the name of that.
Yeah. But anyway, you can
Is
see
it
here.
Bastet?
There
Oh,
you go.
Bauschatz,
That's it right
yeah,
there.
that's right.
Well done. At all events, you can see there's a wide variety of quality in these animal mummies. The rather convincing looking cat at the front, the sort of bowling pin cat in the back, and then, I don't know, the banana that they stuck ears on, the little one there. The people who mummified these things clearly were not above doing dirty tricks. Would you believe that not every animal mummy actually contains an animal in it?
I believe it.
A lot of these things, when they've been broken open, and archaeologists have done this, you just find bones or you find like cow bones or stones or sticks in them, and they're just made up to look like the animal. But again, cat mummies, baboon mummies as well. Most famous mummy, though, of all, of course, is the crocodile mummy.
Oh, yeah.
These are the mummies that we find in the greatest quantity, and this is where the lame joke comes in, and maybe this will be the last one. Story goes like 125 years ago, when the sort of beginning of Greco-Roman archaeology in Egypt began, a site known as Tebtunis was mentioned in one of the texts I talked about today. It was being excavated, and the workmen found a temple. And once they found the temple, everyone was excited because they thought there's going to be a bunch of mummies in there, hopefully human mummies, because at that point, around 1900, pretty much only human mummies were the ones that had been attested as containing papyrus that might have writing on it. And so everyone's getting excited. They get into the tomb and they discover row upon row of crocodile mummies like this itsy bitsy guy right here or this big guy over here. And at that point, these were essentially considered garbage archaeological objects of no value. You find dozens and dozens of them. The story goes that one of the workmen was so mad that they had found a temple filled with crocodile mummies that he picked one of them up and he smashed it to the ground. But it was a lucky break. It was a knee slapper. Because inside of the papyrus was actually a number of, inside of the mummy was a bunch of papyri, which had writing on it. And the lucky part about it was that once they had then gone through the rest of the crocodile mummies, which I believe they basically just ripped open in looking for more papyrus, something like only 7% of all of the crocodiles in that tomb had papyrus with writing on it. So he indeed got lucky when he smashed that mummy.
Now, could you say why he was angry? He wanted more valuable mummies and loot, that kind of thing, and he was disappointed? Is that
human mummies? It was human mummies
right.
often can be buried with things like amulets or other things. They have writing on them. You can find out who a person is. They might have a mask, a painted mummy mask. These animal things, though, are just mass-produced trinkets, I think, in the minds of these early archaeologists. And, once you've seen a few hundred of these after working at a site, you get your hopes up, you get into the tomb, and you see more of them. I don't know, or maybe the guy was having a bad day. But story goes that he broke it, and they lucked out.
Wonderful story.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. Thank you. I see we've got a couple more comments. Bob asks, what's going to become of our documents in the deep future time now that we are only in volatile digital form? Yes, Bob, I think about this all the time. What are we leaving behind? Maybe the happier thing to think about is that there will be no civilization for us to dig through, and people in the future, because we'll just completely obliterate ourselves. So we won't have to worry about people digging through the ash of our civilization. That might not actually be the happier thing to think about, but it's a good question, right? When all of your information isn't in physical form, what happens when that information is lost, right? It's totally lost. And there are things today that, even within 20 years, there's not going to be any records of them because we don't prioritize physical media.
Oh, and you can go, have you seen that 1960, The Time Machine with George Pal's version? It talks about that. They have a very few books, but they crumble,
Yeah.
in the future.
Yeah. I mean, you're sacrificing one thing for another, and I'm not going to say it's good or bad, but it definitely raises questions about what future generations are going to know about us if they lose access to the cloud, right? Because if we're putting everything up there and that's gone, then what do they have? They've got the shell of an Aegis, but there's no paper inside it. So they're going to have to say, oh, this Aegis thing must be a temple. We have no idea what it is, but it's probably a temple. Look, they built it. Um, I won't be around to see that and shake my head, though. So I guess, I don't know. Not a big deal for me, but a good question overall.
What about women? Were women scribes?
It doesn't look like women were scribes. Virtually every scribe that you know of with a name, it's a clear man's name. But women certainly did go to scribes to have letters written, right? We know that women would write petitions if crimes were committed. They often highlight the fact that they're women or that they're widowed or that they were pregnant when a crime was committed, always pushing buttons to make themselves look more hopeless or more pitiable in one way or another. It's not just
Women did have property rights.
they could. Women could own property, though it may have been different under the Ptolemies than it was in the Pharaonic period. I think in many ways women had fewer rights under the Ptolemies than they did before, because Greeks in general weren't really big on giving rights to women. I think the Egyptians in general were a more open society to that than the Greeks or Macedonians would have been.
That I knew about the Greeks.
Yeah.
Well, it raises so many questions of this dual culture they had going. And you have to wonder, all the places where one culture would have had a contact zone with the other one, how they negotiated that. And it seems to have been going on, and it didn't just go into civil war or anything.
No, and it's definitely a multicultural society. Lots of evidence of intermarriage over time, assimilation. It's primarily sort of upward assimilation. Egyptians marrying into Greek families, taking on Greek names, learning Greek. Certainly scribes, all of these Egyptian scribes who knew Egyptian, if they wanted to keep their jobs, once the Greeks took over, they had to learn Greek as well. But that became a huge business for them because all the Egyptian people who needed to interact with the government had to get scribes who could write in Greek. And so that certainly happens. The degree to which the Greeks condescended to learn Egyptian and really cared about Egyptian traditions, harder to tell, but there certainly are examples of people who were ethnically Greek or Macedonian and had a fondness for Egyptian stuff, learned Egyptian, and took on Egyptian roles. Yeah, to one degree or another, but not a ton of evidence of that.
Well, it's amazing. I'm sure as time goes on, you'll get more. It's like a jigsaw puzzle, more pieces. Oh, here comes Iman.
We got a question?
I think he's got
Oh,
more.
there's a play. Oh, okay. That's interesting. So they filmed the play. There's a movie too. I've seen the beginning frames of the movie, not more than that. But I'm glad to see there's something out there. Now we've got something to do with the rest of our Saturday morning.
Oh, yeah. Great. I'll have to copy that. Well, these are wonderful revelations to me. I know maybe for others, it certainly challenges many of the things we thought we knew about Egypt. Here's one of the ones, everything is separate. And I know I told you that they're redoing the rooms at the Field Museum in Chicago because they used to have like a Berlin Wall between Egypt and the rest of Africa. And now they're redoing that whole exhibit because Egypt is in Africa. And they had more dealings down the Nile up south of Egypt.
Right.
And again, it isn't like Egypt, a big wall separate, Greece, a big wall separate. They were all intermingled. So it's going to take them 1.5 to 2 years to redo that exhibit. But Doesn't
Well,
that reflect the latest research?
absolutely, right? It doesn't make any sense to put up walls where there never were any. And it's, I think the biggest problem is from the beginning, people who study these civilizations focused only on these civilizations. And
Mhm,
that's how they were sort of transmitted to the world. And that's how people came up thinking about them. Egypt in particular, it's that one place. You
mhm.
easily forget that it's part of a continent where they would have been traveling and interacting with lots of other cultures that aren't as well documented, but were there. Um, and yeah, kudos to the museum for doing that. It's high time.
I wonder what Imad thinks of that. Do you think that's good, Imad, that they're redoing their exhibits at the Field Museum?
I'd say yes.
That's, yeah. It, is that happening in Egypt itself? Are they redoing? I'm sure they had, because they were, was it ruled by France for many? I forget which cultures ruled, as colonialists. They probably replicated that. Are they redoing their displays too?
Um, didn't get that impression.
Yeah.
Imad, you're in Egypt right now, is that correct?
Yes.
Have you been to the new museum?
The new one, no. New Cairo, no.
Yeah, I'm really
Only been to
excited
the
about that. I'm thinking that too might kind of break down a lot of the traditional barriers about the way Egypt has been seen in the world. We're sort of letting the Egyptians themselves run the show. And I mean, all the evidence I've seen so far is that it's a really spectacular place.
I think there's a little lag because, it's so far, he's in Cairo. So if he is answering, it may take a few seconds. Well, I was thinking too, people, if all we had of the United States were our museums, it's another question I'm throwing at you, Imad. If all we had from the US is our museums, does that really represent all about us? And how do you feel about everybody thinking?
Oh, I have an idea. Just realized something. A Egyptologist friend of mine from Cairo University. She
Uh-huh,
told me that the standard story about the Hyksos conquering Egypt isn't true.
uh-huh.
They were already living in Egypt, and then the state became weak, and they took over the system. They just were regular migrants.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
that's actually been finally been proven now. I was watching a YouTube video, and they were doing not DNA analysis, radiation analysis on Hyksos people buried in Egypt, and how long, and that could tell you how long they'd been living there and
Mhm.
interacting with the environment and absorbing radiation, things like that. And it said that whole story about conquest was in a Ptolemaic historian like 1,000 years after the event.
Hmm.
That's the only source we have supposedly of this invasion, and it never actually happened.
now that's a revelation.
So no, Egyptians, most Egyptians, their view of history is a colonized view. It's from the
Mhm.
Western historians,
Yeah.
and we have to start remembering that we're Africans as well, and from the Near East. We're not just Egyptians, and getting our version of Egypt from the French, or and Champollion, and these
Mhm.
kind of things.
Yeah.
Yeah. So no,
Applause.
yeah. So yeah, that's fertile ground actually. Let me think. I have a science fiction story. It's not set in Egypt. It's set in Mesopotamia. But what I do there is correct historical, things that have been written wrong about historical figures,
Oh,
and that
is
could be
it
easily.
published,
Yeah,
Imad?
it's online. I'll get it to you. I'll
Oh,
get the
yeah,
information.
please.
I'm sorry that I'm a bit slow. I was asleep because I wanted to stay awake early, late at night because I thought this was happening at 7 a.m.
Oh,
because the Zoom thing said that. That's why I'm not
I'm
completely
so
without
sorry.
my wits. I mean,
Well, thanks for coming anyway. I appreciate bringing that to light. I really, it makes you wonder why people make up these stories about conquest. And the first thing that comes to mind, it's a much better story to say this violent invading force came in and overran the civilization, as opposed to saying, yeah, these people who have been here for several centuries gradually intermixed with us. And, the government became weak over a period of several decades. And yeah, there was sort of a coup. It doesn't sell papyrus scrolls quite as well as the narrative of the invading force. But I think a lot of times that that less spectacular version of history is the correct one.
Oh, there's the story. Wow. Well, here we go. Let's see if anyone else wants that story. That's amazing that you've written about it's sort of what we call meta code, it's the level above where someone who's a participant in a culture looks at what has been done. It's like meta code in a web page where this is the level above all the stuff in the web page. It's very good that we've gotten to this stage, because that's what we need is parallax views. You know what that is, right, John?
Parallax views. I know what parallax scrolling is on a video game. Multiple layers in the background moving at the same time.
Yeah, well, it comes out of, either ballistics or astronomy or very other science and technology. It means where you're looking at one object, but from different places, so that you get the view from, say, Egypt, and you're looking at the moon, but you're getting measurements from Egypt, or you're getting it from Tucson. And then the more of them, the better, not the right one. One isn't the right one. That's different philosophy, you see.
Right.
It's accumulative, and it's the more accurate is the more views you have. So this to my mind is adding our parallax views, and it doesn't totally invalidate previous knowledge. It says, well, this is only your view, it's not the whole picture.
Exactly.
And it's amazing. And I found your two talks so unusually useful for a group like ours. And I know people are watching them in the recorded form. And because a lot of people, for one reason or another, they space out, they don't get it live. But Egypt is becoming visible, maybe more than many of the other places, because of all this papyrus that's out there, the day-to-day level. I think it's only because they use papyrus. Many of the other very ancient cultures only use stone, and that's much more limiting, right?
Well, yeah, I mean,
Right.
it is. But most of these cultures use papyrus on a daily basis. That was the number one daily writing
But their
medium.
climates, I'm thinking of like the Mayans. The only things that stay in a jungle climate would be the stone,
Absolutely. And that's why, we don't have papyri from Athens and Rome and other parts of the Mediterranean, because the climate destroys it. But Egypt is different.
Yeah, so
This is why I like to think that there might have been similar police structures in other civilizations that we don't hear about, because their story is only told on this perishable material.
And that's part of the what is it? I would call it like the lottery of human history, is that it's who just manages through all these hoops. You get through these hoops of climate, and you happen to write on the right material, rather than they're the only ones who did it.
Yeah. Yep.
Anybody want to jump in with anything here? I know this is going to be a good recording, and it's really going to be popular with our time traveling writers.